Today we speak with Imogene Salva, author of One Star Away. It's the story of her family's struggle in World War II. Her family's story is parallel to my family's story. The struggle of Polish exiles during World War II in the Soviet Union, today on Safety Wars. How is this all related to safety, you might ask? Part of safety is resilience, faith, hope, and optimism, even in life's most difficult and unimaginable circumstances. The truth is, I really don't have the words to describe how I feel about the Nowicki family and their story, but I will borrow a few lines from one of my favorite movies, The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. If you're familiar with the movie, you'll recognize his speech by Samwise Gamgee in The Two Towers. The scene starts out like this. Frodo says, "I cannot do this, Sam." Samwise Gamgee answers, "It's all wrong. By rights, we shouldn't even be here, but we are." It's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and danger they were. And sometimes you didn't want to know the end. Because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was when so much bad happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing, the shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come. And when the sun shines, it will shine out the clearer. Those are the stories that stayed with you, that meant something, even if you were too small to understand why. But I think, Frodo, I do understand. I know now. Folks in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't, because they were holding on to something. Frodo answers, "What are we holding on to, Sam?" "That there's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for." For the Polish refugees that were expatriated against their will, it was a hope to be reunited with their family in a free Poland. Estimates run all over the board, between 600,000 to 1 million dead in the Soviet Union alone, including 12 of my family members. It's estimated that only 50,000 out of 2 million Poles eventually returned from this exile. These are official numbers from communist-occupied Poland and the former Soviet Union. So the truth is that we really don't know the numbers, but we do know those people's stories, thanks to people like Imogene Salva. Today on Safety Wars, it is my honor to have a conversation with Imogene Salva, author of One Star Away. All right, so today, like I said in my introduction, we're talking to Imogene Salva, the author of One Star Away. I came across this book, and because my normal interactions and everything else, my mother is a subscriber to Zgota newspaper, which is the Polish newspaper put out by Polish National Alliance, which is a life insurance group out of Chicago. And she said, "Boy, this woman's story sounds a lot like mine." So she says to me, "Jimmy, please order this on Amazon for me, One Star Away." And before you know it, we got the 2 copies of the book and an electronic copy of the book on Kindle. And it's one of those books, like my introduction said, you have no idea what to do with this, because it's sad, it's happy. You want it to end because a lot of the things are very painful. I'll be honest, it's very painful to read, because I have a personal connection with my family with these stories, and just horrible stories. But then you can't let it end because you want to find out, how it ends, and it's a happy ending at the end of the book. It's a very happy ending, very motivational, very uplifting. And is that
what you basically hear about your book? What are the normal comments that you hear?
Oh, well, thank you, first of all, for having me. And yeah, I'm always happy when somebody tells me that there's a happy ending at the end of the book. And that is true. A lot of ups and downs throughout, but my mother, thank heavens, she eventually came here to the United States. So there is a happy ending.
Great. So both of my mother and your mother and your grandmother, right, and the extended families, for the listeners, this is a very brief history. The Soviet Union were allies with Nazi Germany at the beginning of World War II. And both countries attacked Poland in 1939, was it, Imogene?
Yes.
1939, the end of 1939. And the Russians from the east, Germans from the west, and both sides have their own stories. On the Soviet Union side, they expatriated roughly about 2 million. Well, there are estimates all over the place, but anywhere from 500,000 to 2 million people. I tend to lean towards the 2 million. And they put them in camps, concentration camps in Siberia. That's where your family went. My family went up to, I cannot say it in Polish, Archangel, Russia, which is the northern port city on the Arctic Circle. And they eventually ended up in the custody of the British during World War II, and made their way through Iran, made their way eventually to India and Pakistan, what's today Pakistan, and eventually made their way back to the United States. And that's, in a nutshell, the whole history of the entire book was on your family's story over there. It was 8 people, correct? Started out with 8 people. Unfortunately, didn't end with 8 people. On my side of the family, it started with 12 people, and they ended up with 3 people. So, coming out of the camps. So, it was just a very horrible story. So, Imogene, what really inspired you to write this story?
I was inspired by the true stories my mother told me of her childhood. The fact that she and her family lived through such an unimaginable nightmare during World War II has never ceased to amaze me. The courage, resilience, and sacrifices they endured are worthy of a story. Unfortunately, as you just mentioned, though, their story was quite common amongst us Poles. Historians estimate, like you said, the number of Poles who were sent to Siberia during World War II to be around 1.7 million. And I was astonished throughout my whole life to learn that this piece of history, which is so personal to you and me, is shared by thousands, like your own family, but so foreign to this day to the multitudes and remains relatively unknown to the rest of the world. Unfortunately, the Jewish Holocaust was a fraction of the millions upon millions massacred by Stalin.
Some estimates go in upwards of anywhere from 50 to 100 million. I've heard some estimates 150 million. I don't know, but no, everybody has their story here. The Polish people have their story. Unfortunately, what happened was, since we were allies with the Soviet Union during World War II, towards the end of the World War II, a lot of these stories were, I don't want to say suppressed, but they weren't talked about with this because, we were in with the Soviet Union there, and we were allies, and we had financed a lot of the Soviet Union as far as the war machine over there. So this is what happens, right? This is essentially what happens. So the book starts out with a very controversial figure, the Shah of Iran. And as we say here on Safety FM, there's an inside Iggy on that one. There's an inside story on the Shah of Iran. What exactly is that story? How do you start out the story? He's a very controversial figure, at least in the West. But as my father often says, nothing's totally good, nothing's totally evil. So, what's some of the story on him?
Well, I have a few thoughts on the Shah. I don't want to give the story away, but after the Shah died in 1980, my mother had related to me that she had been on duty at New York Hospital while he was a cancer patient, and she had been so happy to treat him as a small thank you. Sadly, at the age of 15, in 1979, I didn't fully understand the importance Shah Reza Mohammad Pahlavi had for my mom. In 1942, there were about 120,000 Poles, barely hanging on to life, they started a mass exodus from many remote parts of the USSR to freedom in Iran. And Iran at that time, at the beginning of the war, had been seriously affected by political instability and famine following a joint invasion of the country by the Soviet Union and Great Britain. British and Soviet troops from then on occupied Iran. And the first Pahlavi Shah, who they regarded with suspicion, was forced to abdicate in favor of his son Mohammad Reza, the same Shah that was my mother's patient in 1979. So it's important to note that the Soviets and the Brits confiscated and sent all of Iran's resources to the front line in Europe. Despite famine, hardships in Iran at the time, the Iranians greeted the Poles escaping communism with much generosity. And in Tehran alone, the refugees were accommodated in several camps, I think around 4 camps, one of which was the private gardens of the young Shah, which was later transformed into a temporary refugee camp and a hospital. But the Shah became, throughout his reign, a Cold War ally of the U.S. in the Middle East. And it's sure known that the Shah in his reign used brutal force to suppress communist and Islamic opposition to his Western reforms. History maybe is vilified. They passed judgment on him, on the Shah of Iran. However, my opinion is that, when your country borders the USSR, it's threatened by communists, and you don't follow 100% of all the dictates of the CIA, who put the Shah in power indefinitely following the 1953 CIA-led coup, you're not going to be liked by everyone. But my thoughts on him regarding my mother's story is that they had one thing in common, and that is that both felt betrayed by their American and British so-called allies. And this was a feeling that united them.
Well, and here's something else. You solved the mystery for us with this, because my mother always had a picture of the Shah of Iran and with her things that she was able to keep through her journey. And now we understand why she always had a picture of him, because this was a very, the Polish people really liked him because of this. He saved them from starvation there.
Yes,
and that's a whole other story for another podcast, that whole thing. With that, it's not relevant to the book, and we want to talk about the book. And if it weren't for him, neither one of us would be here. We can honestly say that. I think.
Very true.
Because, this, in short, my understanding of the history is that the Soviet Union needed men to fight the Germans, and the Allies needed that. They decided to create a Polish army out of the refugees, out of the expatriates, from Poland. And what ended up happening was the Allies only wanted the men. What ended up happening was they took everybody. So General Anders took everybody, and now you have 120,000 people plus sitting over in the Caspian Sea. Now what are you going to do? Now you have a refugee issue. That's when they were taken over into Tehran at that point, Tehran. So that's basically what happened. Now, part of the reason why we're having this interview is not only to relive history as a historical thing, but a lot of people are having problems today, remaining optimistic. All people have always had it with the COVID situation, and there's serious mental health issues in this country for various reasons. And one of the things that I like about this book is people are optimistic. people made it through horrible situations, and it's to give people some hope with their own situation. That's all part of safety, right? Optimism. How did the families deported to Siberia keep so optimistic? Because there's a theme of optimism throughout the whole book. Yeah, there's some despair, but there's some optimism. How were they able to keep so optimistic on their situation and have hope?
Well, I don't think they were optimistic all the time. I think a better word might be faith. As Catholics, they relied on their faith to carry them through the rough times, for sure, knowing God was with them every step of their exile, from their arrest in Poland to the harsh Siberian conditions, starvation, illnesses, separation, etc. Faith was their pillar, and it is Poles' devotion to their Catholic faith, which has to a large extent molded our unbreakable spirit and has resurrected Poland from the ashes in her 1,000-year history. And it was also true for my mom and her family. You know, when all around them was nothing but despair and darkness, their eyes saw light. And we know that only faith makes that possible, and faith in Christ makes it achievable.
Absolutely. So, what kind of lessons? No, I think you answered this question, but how do you apply the lessons from this story, from this history?
The lessons learned in my mother's life, I believe, can be applied to anyone's life. We all face challenges, as you said. We all face adversities. So do we respond in times of need with anger, bitterness, resentment, or do we respond with love and forgiveness? For the Novitskys, we act and respond with great love. And love, contrary to what our modern society tells us, is not an emotion. Love is a decision to will the good of the other, no matter what. It is a responsible choice, which takes courage and grace, especially when we're hurt or harmed by others. It's hard to love and forgive. The bigger and more serious the offense, the harder it becomes. And you and I know we can't do that on our own. But with God, all things are possible. You know, we choose not to have any ill will toward our perpetrators. And it's not about forgetting the offense committed. God gave us a memory. Not always does forgiveness mean reconciliation. And my mother wasn't reconciled with her land or the Russians after the war. But forgiveness is about letting go and not wishing any misfortune on our offenders. And basically the lesson is, he who forgives prepares himself for peace and abundant graces. It's a choice that makes us appreciate the magnitude of God's mercy toward us.
Nothing. I don't think I could add anything to that. Right, you have to forgive, and otherwise it destroys you. You know, you're the one that impacts. Remember, the perpetrators, it doesn't even it doesn't even impact them. The more that you hate and not forgive, the more power you give them also over you. Next one. I can tell you how it was growing up, you know, with my grandmother and my mother. So you probably had a similar experience. I know you spoke with my mother about this. Since our parents went through such hard times, anything that came up was not a big deal for us, right? So if I was having some kind of problem at school or anything, well, so what? I had it worse. My mother was like the only person I know who saw the movie on nuclear war the day after, and so I've been through worse. So, how do you think it impacted your childhood?
Well, my mom, she taught us to value everything. Nothing went to waste. Everything, from never wasting a crumb to being so grateful for running water, a bathtub, a roof over our heads, heat, freedom to go to school, and especially to worship God. In everything, we were taught to have an attitude, a gratitude, and never to complain. And she always encouraged us to be self-reliant, very flexible, well-educated, which for my mom and now my sister and myself, and for us, the offspring, it means knowing firsthand your history, world history, like my mom, medicine too, even though I'm not a doctor, and other things which I've discovered in my lifetime, as well as in my mom's life, is contrary, very much contrary to the narrative of many so-called prominent sources, you know, media outlets that we listen to.
The scouting story here, I found it very moving. I sent it to my son's Cub Scout leader. And as you know, my mother was a scout over there also. So basically, this is the setting. You have a bunch of children in these camps. You have to have something for the children to do. Survival skills, most of those kids, you probably couldn't teach anything about survival skills. But you could teach about camaraderie and all the other things that go into scouting. My mother has a picture of herself as a scout in the uniform and everything else out there. So scouting takes up a big part of the story. Where I found it very moving, the story in here, where did you want to make a comment on that, on how much scouting? How did you come about that with your mother?
Thank you so much. I just want to say I'm so glad you liked that chapter. It's probably not everybody's number one favorite activity, and I was never a scout, but yes, certainly I would say that mostly the children like you of the Polish survivors have shared with me cherished memories, great memories, stories of the parents' scouting adventures, lifelong friendships made. In India, the Polish children who came were recuperating from years of traumatic experiences in Russia, and they were extremely lucky to have what they call druhna. It's like the guider, Janina Ptak, who was a very young and beautiful woman. She was the one who organized the scout movement in the Balachadi camp near Jamnagar.
That's in India.
Yes.
Okay.
She undertook the role of scoutmaster with great passion and determination to get as many children involved as she could. She herself, having lost her own child in the war, I think when they crossed to Iran, her child died. She knew firsthand how traumatized these children were, and that they needed to develop the skills you mentioned, like courage, self-reliance, resourcefulness, and that brotherhood. They were trained in personal hygiene, first aid, prevention of diseases like malaria, especially venomous stings. And as for the venomous stings, scorpions in India, scorpions and snakes were everywhere in the Polish.
My mother has a lot of stories on the snakes. They, with the cobras. The cobras they used to keep in the. And she says how it is in movies is exactly how it was.
Yeah. The children actually had a pet. This is funny. In the Balachadi camp, they had a pet mongoose. I don't know. That's not in the book, by the way, but my mother had recounted many times about this pet mongoose that was an expert snake trapper, and I always thought that was really cute. But the scouting movement in India was certainly different from. It's important to note the Polish scouting organization in Poland, which during the war had gone underground. Wartime Polish scouting, more than in any other country in Europe, prepared their youth not only to learn camping skills, patriotism, the brotherhood, loyalty, but mostly to be future soldiers of Poland, defending their country against their aggressors, namely the Germans and the Russians.
I wanted to share just one paragraph here. From excerpt from your book, because this pretty much sums everything up here, right? I sincerely hope, and this is the Scout Master, I sincerely hope that our Scout and Cub packs have to some extent filled those empty places in your souls and replaced them with brotherhood, for all Scouts are brothers who weather life together, through thick and thin, she concluded in a winning voice. And then it went on to the same song that we sing with my son at the scouting camp. It's the lyrics to Taps, right? Yeah. The day is done, gone the sun, from the sea, from the hills, from the sky, all is well, safety rest, God is nigh. And it's like all the scouts sing that. So it's like you have a connection from the past into what's contemporary. It's the same song. The same thing, and that's what really moved me. Where this was much bigger. Scouting is much bigger than your little Cub Scout group in your church or in your synagogue or mosque or in your town. It's a much bigger movement, international movement. And I thought it was really.
It's noteworthy that, as we were saying, the patriotism is so beautiful. It's so worthy of praise these scouts, these young children, especially in Poland, going back there, they used these scouts they became members of the Polish Home Army, the Polish Resistance, and these songs, my mother would sing them till her last day. And in fact, I have a whole video in India when she's revisiting after 72 years. Those songs, even though my mother had some dementia, she always, every single line, was memorized. But I always remember because it really it shocked me when I was walking the streets of Warsaw the first time. I was a young child. I was always in the southern part, but when I went to the capital and I saw the bullets in every building, and I was like, why?
Yeah.
Times early 70s, and I was like, why are these bullets? Like, what is this? And my father would explain, he's like, oh, this is where 100 scouts were killed. This is where 200 scouts were, and I'm like, what? Hundreds, which I didn't know of, young scouts partook in the Warsaw Uprising and died heroes, and some were captured and died in concentration camps. And the most amazing stories of bravery are those of the Polish scouts. And my mother, for that reason, she loved Druhna Janina Ptak, and she reminisced how the scouts would acquaint themselves with their exotic Indian terrain, the orientation hikes, trail hikes. When they'd be blindfolded, they'd be singing during these campfires under the lit sky and the mysterious Indian moon. They spent many a long night under the sky singing these songs full of longing for their lost homeland. And also it's important to note that the Maharaja, their benefactor, Jam Sahed, he personally saw to it that these children would remain Poles, learn about their culture, language, scouting, everything in Polish. And he actually built them a school, and he wanted them to be equipped so that one day they could return to a free Poland.
Yeah, so, let me say this. History, is abundant with people making the right decisions at the right time when wrong decisions were a lot easier, right? So, for example, in the Jewish Holocaust, you have Oskar Schindler, right? Who saved the German Jews and many others, right? You mentioned the Maharaja. So in this saga, for lack of a better word, I don't have the right words to describe this. No, that's me. I just don't have it, right? The Maharaja, and you'll share his full name because I can't pronounce it, was one of those people here. So why don't you talk about them? Can you talk about the Maharaja very briefly? So basically, they were in Tehran, and they moved to India. Valivada, was it? Or I forget the name.
So from Iran, yes, they came in these army lorries, army trucks, and they went through, well, again, this was British colonial India, so they stopped in Quetta, which is now in Pakistan, but at the time they had to stop because of the monsoon rains and things like that. They eventually made it to the northwestern corner, which actually he's a huge hero, this man that you're talking about, the Maharaja Jam Sahed Digvijay Singhji. He, at the time, if you wanted me to talk about him a little bit?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay,
yes.
So he would be probably the biggest hero of this story. And at the time of this story, he was the leader of the Chamber of Princes of India. He ruled the Principality of Navanagar, of which the capital is Jamnagar, presently called the state of Gujarat. It's no longer called the Navanagar. So it's the state of Gujarat, and that's kind of located in the northwest corner of India, bordering Pakistan. And, Jim, there are few coincidences in this life. So it happened that this same Jam Sahed, as a young boy and the future heir to the throne of Navanagar, he traveled all over the world with his famous uncle and adopted father, because his own father had died when he was a little boy. So his uncle had been the Maharaja of the day, and he represented India at the League of Nations. In this way, the future Maharaja was introduced to Ignacy Paderewski, who was the president of Poland and a world-renowned pianist after World War One. After World War One, between his uncle, the Maharaja of the day, and Paderewski, there was a beautiful friendship which grew. And years later, by World War II, when now the young Maharaja, who is now the leader of Navanagar, and again the leader of the Chamber of Princes of India, when he hears of the plight of these Polish children dying in Russia, he influenced the other princes to sign an agreement to bring Polish orphans and half-orphans to India and support them during their stay. And Jim, that is not just a mere coincidence. That is a providence of God.
Right. Well, my favorite thing is the Soviets wanted to take everybody back. And there was talk about all the expatriates in Poland and our parents' situation to take them back. And you say, you can't take them back. I'm going to adopt them all.
Yeah.
I mean, how many people would have done that? That was a very novel solution, where you adopt several thousand children and say, well, now you can't take them back. They're members of my family.
Well, the communist officials, when already after the Tehran conference in, I believe it was November of 1943, it was established already, that even though in the West we don't hear about it, it was already established that Poland would be partitioned. The Soviet Union would take, 52% of Polish land. And in India, these children, they were so scared of ever returning, obviously, to, Russia. I mean, but they didn't know at the time the fate of their own native lands. But these children, funny enough that you mentioned that, the picture on the cover of the book, the picture of my mom, and I'm sure you have a very similar picture, because every child that lived in India has a similar picture like that, and it's obviously in black and white. And I was like, well, when I met Wiesław Stepua, also another author, and a friend of my mother who went through that same experience, he explained to me that these pictures had been taken by Father Pluta, who was, again, like a father to all these 1,000 orphans, and he took them because he wanted to save them from being repatriated to communist, Russia or Poland. That the communist officials was there to reclaim them, saying that they weren't yet 17 and they had the rights of these children. And these poor, terrified, traumatized children, in the meantime, the father had the idea that he was going to take a picture to show, okay, this is how they looked when they came, nothing but skin and bone, hanging skin on their bones, dying, most of them didn't make it. And now look at them, healthy children, laughing, they recovered from this trauma. So,
I know my mother has a professional photo right out of, you just answered a question for me. There was a professional photo taken in Tehran, when they got off the ship, and everybody was skin and bones. And then they took several. I said, who has time to take these professional photographs? You're in a refugee camp. They looked awfully nice. My mother said they were borrowed. Now that it answers that question for me, that they wanted to document how well they were being treated, and they just went and these are wonderful photos that my mother has. I was like, who had time to do this during a war? But they had it done. That explains that.
It's amazing.
Yeah. So. Now, I have a whole list of questions here. I got to backtrack a little bit. Throughout this whole book, there's a rock. That is one of the centerpieces of this. What significance does that rock have? Because I tell you what, your grandmother was a very wise woman, where she set this up, because not too many people would have thought of it. So, you want to describe the rock?
So I'll say this much, so not to get too much into the detail, that maybe a little bit about, I'll just say that maybe when we're separated from someone we love, often a small token provides comfort in the memory of that loved one. Yeah. It is more than mere sentimentality when we hold the item, caress it, memorize each detail. Feelings that are hidden away are suddenly brought to life. And for my mother, for Zhuta, no tokens from Poland when they were deported. No tokens like that existed. No tokens of comfort from their home. Everything that the family owned had been stripped away in the exile to Siberia. So in the story, basically, I'll just say that Tola, my grandmother, plucked a stone off the ground and assigned my mother, Zhuta, a task in helping her family to keep track of the distance they covered each day in their escape from their gulag, their forced labor camp.
Right.
As their escape progresses to Kubyshev, where the Polish consulate had been, as they're progressing there, the stone becomes the last and only tangible connection to her mother. And my mom, Shuta, is determined in the story to preserve that connection, no matter how risky. And in the story, there's a second stone, too, very prominent,
right.
given to her by Rami, one of the Indian drivers, and that had more of a deep spiritual meaning, more related to discovery of self, which would, at the end of her life, come full circle, when my mom returns to her second homeland, India. But sadly, today, both stones are gone, lost in my mother's many, many moves as time went by. But their memory alone gave my mother really great comfort.
Like I said, it's like you don't know what to do. You don't know whether to be happy, to be sad. There's a lot of, this is up and down, but it always has a happy ending. And with my family, it was a happy ending here. Everybody, the people that made it through really made a significant contribution to their community, really made a significant contribution to their family. An abundance of love. I could say that, there was an abundance of love throughout this story and with our story here. And it's a story that has to be told before it's forgotten. Like in my introduction, this is a story that has to be told. How has this really affected you with this? Because with me and reading your book, a lot of questions were answered for me personally. That's how it impacted me. We just made that discovery now with the photos. How has this really impacted you? I mean, the process of writing this book.
Well, Jim, beyond each and every photograph, I'll start with photographs I've been shown by my mother from her time in India, there is a complete life story. As I started interviewing some of the characters and became acquainted with their incredible experiences, I realized that this story needed to be written. The pages in it, in the book, the pages born in this book are the result of much pain, much suffering, my own. But pain, we know, makes us stronger, more virtuous, more resilient. And it for sure was a hard and emotional task, living through each and every experience of each book character, all the while trying to manage home life, responsibilities, family, my teaching job. And I have to thank my editor, Joasha Pelshinska, who was 100% laboring along with me in this endeavor to finish the book, which ended finally in October of last year of 2020, still last year. Today's the 31st. So October 2020, after we published the book. And basically in the end, giving those who are no longer with us a voice, I believe is so important because their story will live on. Absolutely.
And I tell you what, this was a phenomenal conversation we've had here with this. Now, just for the listeners, you had, and this is not a unique story. This is a story of the Polish exiles. There's many different stories that go along with in other cultures, and the struggle against communism, and the struggle against dictatorships, and people made it through. So whatever we're going through in our life, we can have some inspiration, I guess, with the stories like this, where you don't know exactly how it's going to end. And it's a very good read. It was very important for me, important for my mother, and my mother is not a reader, right? And for her to actually sit down and read this book, it was an important book. It was very accurate and answered some of her stories. Now, where's your book available? So it's available on, I got it on Amazon.com, 1 star away, Imogene Salva. So,
yes, and actually available anywhere now, any bookstore. You can just give the title. There's an ISBN number. They'll look it up. So any bookstore, but probably easiest, as you said, through the internet, Amazon.com. It's available there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I know you have to go. So you had a prior engagement set up, or you're going to church. So it's New
Yes,
Year's
we
Eve.
have
That's
New Year's
That's
Eve.
all good Poles go to church on New Year's Eve. Do you want to add anything else?
Maybe just about, what really surprised me as this was, I was going through the
Right.
emotions and all this.
What surprised you? I had that written down here. What surprised you with this?
Well, I'd like to say that the enormity. I'd like to talk maybe a little bit about the enormity
Yeah, go ahead.
of our Polish nation by our two age-old aggressive enemies, namely, again, the Germans and the Russians. Poland, I don't know how familiar your listeners would be, but Poland was the only country abandoned by her allies at the onset of war and again at the end of the war. And even today, as we speak, the vicious attacks by the mainstream media, calling Poles white supremacists, using words like Polish death camps versus German death camps, it's scandalous. The Germans constructed these death camps in our country with the goal of exterminating all Polish citizens. Even former President Obama had called them Polish death camps when he visited Poland. And, to me as a Pole, that was just very insulting and ignorant, despite being abandoned by our so-called allies at the onset and again at the end of the war. I was surprised at how much Poland was able to accomplish during the war. And maybe, a little bit about those accomplishments, considering that Poland, we received no compensation for the total destruction of whole towns, whole cities, and the death of 20% of our citizens. It's important to note that Poland was the only nation under such persecution, like no other European nation, to have had an underground state formed by the Polish resistance movement, known as, which we said before, the Home Army, or the Armia Krajowa in Polish, which was loyal to the Polish government in exile in London. And very important to say that there were two Polish Catholic women activists, Zofia Kosak and Wanda Krajewska-Filipowicz. These two women, they originally had founded what is called the Council to Aid Jews, or in Polish Żegota, in September of 42. And Żegota provided food, medical care, money, false IDs, plenty of false identification documents to thousands of Polish Jews. This was nowhere else in Europe so well organized. And Żegota, in maybe they helped to save maybe around 4,000 Jews and provide assistance to at least 25,000 in total. And also, we have so many accomplishments, but I think we have to give, because these things are not in the book, but the accomplishments also of the Polish cryptographers, namely 3 Polish mathematicians who cracked the German Enigma code. I don't know how much people are familiar with that, but the Polish Cipher Bureau chiefs, right before the Germans invaded Poland, they made the decision to hand over everything they had on their work cracking the Enigma, including even their replica Enigmas, to French cipher chief Gustave Bertrand and his British counterpart, Alistair Denniston. And the head British cryptanalysts, they were stunned when they discovered just how advanced the Polish code breaking was. Because up to that time, the British had relied on linguistics to try to crack the Enigma messages, whereas the Poles, they had proven that the key to cracking code lay not in linguistics, but in mathematics. And, when the war broke out, Poland fell. It was the work of Rejewski and the Polish Cipher Bureau that led the way for Alan Turing and his team to not only decipher Enigma messages, but then eventually to build a Colossus machine at Bletchley Park that would eventually break, the much more sophisticated German Lorenz cipher that superseded Enigma. So for the world, it is Turing that cracked the Enigma. And in movies like the 2014 The Imitation Game, which was a big success about Turing, the efforts of the Polish cryptographers were reduced to just one line. So for me, upsetting, but the Polish government, they've made some efforts to change this, and they made the names of the 3 Polish cryptographers. So that's Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Różycki, and Henryk Zygalski. Those 3 men are finally getting the recognition they deserve. So if any of your listeners are traveling to Bletchley Park, to England, there's a flag commemorating their contribution to the war effort and reminding everyone that had it not been for the Polish cryptographers of the Polish Cipher Bureau, World War II could have.
When I go when I go to London at the end of this COVID, I have an invitation to London from one of my customers. I'm going to make sure that I go and see it.
Yes.
After this.
It's worthy, very worthy. Also, while you're there, another important thing, since it just came to my head, because if you are going to London, England, another huge contribution that you'll see while you're there and deserves world recognition is the Distinguished Combat Record of Squadron 303, which was one of the 2 Polish squadrons to fight during the Battle of Britain, and one of 16 Polish squadrons in the RAF, the Royal Air Force, during World War II. And their squadron, 303, there have been several movies made about them. They claim the largest number of aircraft shot down of all 66 Allied fighter squadrons engaged in the Battle of Britain, even though they joined months after the battle had begun. And I encourage your listeners, there's a fabulous film available for free on YouTube called Bloody Foreigners, The Untold Battle of Britain. If anyone out there is into learning more about that and the squadron, I highly recommend it. So as Poles, Jim, and Polish Americans, as we have so much to be proud of.
Yes, absolutely. It's incredible, all this, volumes and volumes and volumes to be talked about with us and discussed. It's just that, it's getting it out there, getting the information out there. And I think that one thing that the internet does is link people together. The internet does a lot of evil out there, but it does a lot of good also. And it's like everything else. It's neutral.
Yeah, lots of good. Mm-hmm. Will you be traveling to Poland? Just curious. Have you been?
I went to
the Maharaja school, or?
No. We went to. My grandmother was getting on in age, and she wanted to go back to Poland. So my mother, my father, and I went to Poland in 1993, and we visited Warsaw, Krakow, Zakopane, and Łomża, where my family is from. We're from a small village, Jedniczowo, which is outside of Łomża.
Mm-hmm.
And there was actually a battle of Łomża and a battle of Jedniczowo during World War I and World War II. But anyway, one of those, I forget which one. Anyway, they had, it was very emotional and everything else there. With the communists there, what they forced people to do, with the property and everything else. My family farm, which I've been in the family for generations, is still there. But nobody was really interested in maintaining it, so the state seized it. So, but you hear these stories, and my grandmother's house, where she grew up with, was still there in '93. I don't know where it is now, but it's still there. So it was to hear all these stories about when she was a little girl, and then you see the house. It was very emotional for her and my mother. I still have pictures. I have a picture of my grandmother and I in front of the house, where they moved to once my grandmother, when she got married. She was an old maid at 24, so she got married very late in life. That house is no longer there. When my mother was there in '73, you could still see the foundation of the house. But now there was nothing in '93. So. Wow.
Yeah. Well, if you do go back to Poland, there is a Jam Saheb DBJ school in Warsaw.
Really?
I don't know if you saw it. Yeah,
Nope.
In his honor. It was established, obviously, to honor his legacy. That was after communism fell, obviously, because we couldn't talk about it during communism. But after, and I believe it was probably after '89, when Poland became fully independent, there also is a square in Warsaw named after the Maharaja.
Mm-hmm.
And I think since 2012, there's a small park in the city's southwestern area. It's called Ochota, and it's called the Square of the Good Maharaja, and just a monument dedicated to the wonderful, kind-hearted prince there. And after he died, he was after his death, they had given am actually awarded him with the Commander's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland, a very high honor. And his eldest daughter, Princess Hershad Kumari, was herself in her 80s, probably around, a little bit younger than our parents. She wrote the foreword for the book.
Right.
And just like to mention that she and her family and staff have been most generous in their gifts of time, research, photographs, things like that. And, the Maharaja instilled the belief that helping others is a privilege. And I believe that is just the most beautiful legacy that he left us. And you and I were very blessed to be children of the survivors, who went through this horrific ordeal. But beautiful, had a happy ending, as we began saying, right?
Right. Well, this is the other thing. The story of your uncle and the Battle of Monte Cassino. My uncle was in the Battle of Monte Cassino also. So I would like to think that they knew each other.
Yes.
So,
yes. Yes. It's amazing. It's amazing. I mean, how many people, even when I travel, it's funny. I'm just presently here at my sister's in Pennsylvania, and the other day I was walking in the park, and a lady from Latvia, of all places, in Hanover, Pennsylvania, of all places, and a woman from Latvia. I'm in this little town. I would think it's maybe Amish, or maybe not Amish, sorry, but just local people. And she, I could tell she had more of an Eastern European accent, but we started talking immediately, about, I couldn't believe it, but her whole family, she was talking about their Siberian experience. And wherever we go, people have such incredible stories, and they need to be told.
Well, this is actually what happened to my mother was she was in my grandmother was in the nursing home, and a woman in the room next door was with our parents over there. So,
wow.
It was incredible. So she passed away before we could even talk. It was in the 90s. So, and just very shocking and very upsetting. Now, where's your book available? Let's go there. It's available I got it on Amazon.com. 1 star away, Imogene Salva. So,
yes, and actually available anywhere now. Any bookstore, you can just give the title. There's an ISBN number. They'll look it up. So any bookstore, but probably easiest, as you said, through the internet, Amazon.com. It's available there. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I know you have to go. So you had a prior engagement set up here. You're going to church. So it's New Year's Eve. That's all good Poles go to, is church on New Year's Eve.
Yeah. There's a lovely, actually, I didn't know about Hanover, built by the Germans. I believe Bavarian Germans. There's just many lovely churches here that are from the 1800s. And then there's another place next door. I forgot the name, but it's the Irish built it next door. And so it's very picturesque here. So, we'll go check out some of those pretty churches.
Are you over by Czestochowa?
Actually, no. Doylestown. We'd love to go. We are going to go because we have to visit some graves there of some of our lovely friends that, unfortunately, in the last year, they have passed. Friends that we grew up with, my mother's friends, but that were like aunts to us. We all called everybody Cha-Cha.
Yeah. My uncle and aunt are buried over there in the by the General Anders monument. So he was able to secure that gravesite very early when they first opened up. So they were in a prime location.
Are you tired of hiring safety consultants and safety professionals that don't have any passion for what they're doing? How about those who have never worked in the field or done the dirty work? Is there resistance to taking safety training because the training is boring, irrelevant, and unengaging? Are your employees playing a teen, college student, or someone on the dark web to take the online safety training for them? Look no further. Safety Wars can come to your facility or do most of the training you need through an online platform at times convenient for you. For more information, call me, Jim Posel, your Safety Wars host, at 845-694-4170, or you can email me at jim@safetywars.com. Remember, if you've heard this transmission, you are the solution to unsafe workplaces.